Hello, my name is Michael Blume. I'm an accessibility product manager here at Workday, talking with you today in another session of our Workday Accessibility Level Up series. If you're new to the series, each month we cover a new topic in digital accessibility, from general information, understanding guidelines, how to develop and test, to strategy and content creation. We have something for everyone. And don't worry if you've missed a session, each one is recorded and available to watch for free on our YouTube channel. In previous sessions, we've talked about what digital accessibility is, why it's vital for people with disabilities, and how it benefits everyone, including how it's critical to your organization's success. Today, we'll be taking a closer look at the accessibility conformance standard called WCAG. First, I'll give a quick refresher on what WCAG is and some of the key terms associated with the standard. Next, I'll review some key questions to ask yourself in order to review accessibility conformance on a digital product or service. And lastly, I'll give a brief overview of the top 8 WCAG criteria that most frequently have gaps. All right, let's jump in. Accessibility is important across the world. It's why we're here. But did you know that most of the developed and developing countries around the world have national disability regulations? You could imagine it might be tricky to remember all of the various regulations and how to apply them. But fortunately, there is one globally accepted international standard when it comes to software accessibility. WCAG, WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, is the definitive technical standard for how to make digital content accessible. I like to think of it as a ruler, in that it's the primary way that we can measure the accessibility of a product or service. WCAG was first released in 1999, but has been updated several times over the last 26 years. The most recently released version of WCAG is version 2.2. There are also different levels of WCAG conformance. Level A, AA, and AAA. Level AA is widely regarded as the best practice for testing WCAG conformance, as it provides a good balance between achieving a high level of accessibility and being a realistic, achievable goal for digital products. In summary then, as of the time of the presentation, WCAG 2.2 AA is the global gold standard for accessibility, and I highly recommend testing against this version when assessing accessibility conformance. Do all of the countries around the world measure to WCAG 2.2? No. Laws and regulations do not always get updated to the latest technical specifications right away. So if you look around the world and you're looking at these different laws, you'll see a wide range from WCAG 2.0 all the way to WCAG 2.2. However, to date, all the versions of WCAG have been backwards compatible. So if your content conforms with the latest version of WCAG, then it'll also conform with previous versions. Now let's think about how to actually evaluate accessibility. When you're testing something for the first time, we found that asking these 3 questions can help identify some 80% of accessibility issues, so they're a great place to start. The first question is, does all of the text, UI, and every keyboard focus indicator meet minimum contrast standards? There are different numbers depending on whether you're trying to make an image visible or make text readable, but the underlying principle is the same. People with a lower perception of color need to be able to read text and see buttons. There are some great free tools out there for measuring, which I'll share later in this session. Secondly, can all interactive UI, things that are clickable, also be navigated with a keyboard alone using tab, arrow keys, and the enter key? People with motor dexterity impairments, people with low vision, and the blind are some examples of people who need to use the keyboard instead of a mouse for navigation. Lastly, is visible information conveyed to screen readers? Think of all the images, dynamic UI, toast notifications, and more that you've seen on modern websites. All of this information must be rendered in a way that can be perceived and operated by a blind or low vision person. Let's now dive deeper into the WCAG criteria behind all of these considerations. Instead of going through them chronologically, I thought it'd be more informative for those of you who've never seen these before to go through areas that are more closely related to each other logically. As I mentioned before, there are 2 minimum standards for contrast. 1.4.3 contrast minimum requires that text meets a contrast ratio of 4.5 to 1 against the background, and that large text meets a ratio of 3 to 1 against the background. Large text here is defined as 18 point or bold 14 point. 1.4.11 non-text contrast requires that UI such as buttons, links, and focus indicators meets a contrast ratio of 3 to 1 against the background. This also applies to different states. For example, selected states or other states that might be present. I've listed some great free tools here that we leverage to measure contrast ratios internally at Workday, but there are other tools out there, and by no means should these be the only ones that you're considering using. Next, let's think about keyboard functionality. 2.1.1 requires that all functionality must be operable using the keyboard alone. This can include Tab, Shift-Tab, and the arrow keys to navigate, space and enter to activate UI that has been navigated to, and Escape to close menus and dialogues. While keyboard shortcuts are an acceptable way of facilitating this kind of interaction, they're often not easy to learn. Careful attention should be paid to which shortcuts are selected so that they don't overly conflict with shortcuts for assistive technology like screen readers. Some other closely related WCAG criteria include 2.4.7 focus visible and 2.4.3 focus order. 2.4.7 focus visible simply requires that when you are keyboard navigating through a page, focus should always be visible. 2.4.3 focus order, on the other hand, requires that the order you keyboard navigate between focusable elements should follow the expected sequential order. For left to right languages, this would be left to right and top to bottom. Here's an example of what that looks like visually. You can see focus moves from the top left text input, first name, to the top right text input, last name, to address, and so on through all the fields from left to right, top to bottom, until getting to the bottom right button, Submit. Next up is WCAG 1.3.1 Info and Relationships. This criterion requires that structure and relationships of the UI can be programmatically determined or are otherwise available in text. Some common examples of the types of considerations that apply here include required fields. Think of all the form fields that have asterisk required inputs to be filled in. There are also errors on fields. Think about how confusing it would be if you didn't perceive an error because it wasn't communicated on the form field you navigated to. For screen reader users who are blind, this can be a huge issue. Also, we have correct table markup, which includes things like table captions indicating the table title, column headers, and row headers if applicable. Next, identifying headings is very important. This includes identifying major sections of content, kind of like chapters in a book. And closely related to that is not skipping heading levels. Returning to the book analogy, it would be pretty weird if you went directly from a chapter to a subsection, right? And lastly, list markup. Providing an unordered bulleted list or an ordered list where appropriate and necessary is important. It's worth stressing that other visual relationships may also need to be communicated, which I've not listed here, especially at the platform level for large applications like Workday's. This is intended to be a starting point and a floor, not the ceiling. Speaking of headings, there's another major criterion in the top 8 that has to do with headings, 2.4.6 headings and labels. You can think of this criterion as basically asking the question, do headings and labels on the page clearly describe their topic or purpose? One pernicious trend in this area continues to be the prevalence of a read more link and other overly generic headings and labels. Practitioners can and should do better with this. Often when I see a read more link on a website, it's at the bottom of an interactive card. So a common workaround tends to be making the title of the card an interactive link and removing the read more link altogether. This can have secondary benefits in giving back more space and improving the SEO. Now last but definitely not least, we have one of the largest and most complex WCAG criteria, 4.1.2 name, role, value. At a high level, this criterion requires that every UI element on a website have a clearly identifiable name, role, and value so that screen reader users get enough information about what the UI element is. But what is a name? What is a role? And what is a value? The name or label of an element indicates what it is supposed to be used for. The role, or type of thing that an element is typically built into semantic HTML tags. Examples of HTML tags which do not communicate a role by default are span and div tags. For accessibility, if an element is meant to communicate interactivity, we generally recommend using a semantic HTML tag for this reason. The value of an element communicates its state and any additional descriptive information associated with it. Examples of values include the checked state of a checkbox, the disabled state, and associated field errors. Here's an example of what that looks like in action. When a username text input receives focus with the screen reader voiceover, You might hear something like username, edit, type in text. Username here is the name or label of the element. Edit is the role, which communicates that this is a text input and is computed directly using the input type equals text HTML tag. Type in text is additional value information, which in this case is being filled in by the screen reader. With that, we've reached the end of our talk. We've covered a lot of information today about the WCAG criteria. Remember that the examples we've discussed today aren't a comprehensive list of all the WCAG criteria and are more meant to serve as a baseline for you to begin your accessibility journey. There are a wide variety of accessibility conformance and universal design practices for you to explore and grow in, and that's not including what you might learn from user research. In future Level Up sessions, we'll dive deeper into accessibility skills for developers, a series of sessions on testing for accessibility, accessibility strategy, and mobile accessibility. Many of the best practices associated with how to meet WCAG criteria that we've discussed today will also be discussed in more detail in these other sessions, so stay tuned. Thanks for joining.